Hello, and welcome to season 0 of the Duncan and Co. History Show. I'm Mike Duncan. My co-host is Alexis Co., and we are two far-flung history buddies.
And this is our wide-ranging archival mix of a show.
And today's episode is about Mary Lincoln, not Mary Todd Lincoln, Mary Lincoln. And this came up in our episode on the rabbit holes that we go down when we're out online. And I was bouncing around finding things and wound up on a entry for Mary Todd Lincoln, which I know is, a real pet peeve of Alexis's. And we touched on it just like a little bit, but there's so much more. Alexis, please now tell us the story of Mary Lincoln.
At 1 o'clock in the afternoon on May 19th, 1875, an unexpected visitor knocked on the door of Mary Lincoln's hotel room. It was Leonard Swett, one of her late husband's law associates. Mary Lincoln, who had bestowed the title of first widow on herself, had just arrived in Chicago ahead of the 10-year anniversary of the assassination of her husband, Abraham Lincoln.
So this is a big deal.
This is a big deal. She answers the door. She sees it's Leonard Swett. She assumes that he's there because he read that she had come to town and he was there to pay his respects. He was not. Swett told Mary she had 1 hour to dress for a court date she didn't know she had. She would be tried for insanity, a charge she didn't know had been leveled against her. She would hear testimony from a dozen male doctors, some of whom she'd never met.
That's crazy. He shows up. You're being tried for insanity in an hour. Get ready. Let's go.
Yes.
Does she know any of these doctors? Has anybody talked to her before this trial?
So she had met some of the doctors. She had met some of them at the worst possible moments in her life, in the middle of her son's deaths. Notice that was plural, deaths. So she met one of the doctors in 1850 when her son Eddie, then 3, died from an unknown disease. She met another one when Willie, who was 11, died. And of course, the doctor who saw her in 1871 when Tad, who was 18, died from lung disease, was there too. Doctors who were not talking to her in her best moments or assessing her for what they are testifying about. She was not the patient.
Right. And one of the things that we have talked about, and I actually put this in Hero of Two Worlds, is that there's this kind of assumption that people these days have where, oh, well, in the past, like kids just died pretty regularly. So obviously parents must not have cared about their kids as much, or like people die all the time. So obviously everybody's just like a more emotionally cold and reserved. And the thing is, like, no, like we're all human beings. They were human beings. When their kids died, it was a tragedy. When your parents died, it was a tragedy. It's just that everybody was walking around with a lot of grief and trauma. And Mary Lincoln dealt with a lot of trauma. There's a lot of kids dying. I wouldn't have made it through most of this.
No, it's 3 out of 4 children, which Swett knows. Like, he knows this. He knows every single tragedy we've just reviewed and more, but he's not just an escort. He's not there to just deliver this bad news and then walk her to the courthouse. He was the lead prosecutor.
Wait, but he was Lincoln's former law partner.
Yes.
He's not there to defend her. He's there to prosecute her.
Yes.
Does she have an attorney?
Yes, she does. Swett took care of that too. He chose her attorney, a man by the name of Isaac Arnold. He was chosen by Swett to lead the defense. But I want to back up first, because obviously Mary Lincoln shows up in Chicago expecting a very different scene.
Yeah, she's the widow of a martyred president. I'm assuming she thought she would show up and everybody would pay their respects to her. That's what she's there for. That's what she deserves.
She doesn't expect the best. She thinks that her presence will remind people of her great loss. She does feel, rightly so, that she's been mistreated in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, a posture she'll soon deem premature. We have to go back in order to understand this very briefly. April 14th, 1865, a notorious day in American history, the night Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. But we're going back to the day, so earlier. It started out much better than most in the Lincoln White House. The presidency is hard on any marriage. The Lincolns were no exception. A civil war is not the best for marital relations. So he realizes that Mary could, use a date night. The Confederacy had just surrendered, 6 days old. And he's like very cute about it. He sent her a note requesting permission to accompany her on an afternoon carriage ride and then to see Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. So it was like he was courting her. And the driver, of course, he was eavesdropping on Lincoln because, it's Lincoln. And he's saying really interesting things. He's 42 days into his second term. And yet there he is talking about their future. And part of this is he is trying to sort of make amends with Mary. But they're talking about taking a train ride across America, all the way to California, a steamer to Europe. Lincoln wants to make it to Jerusalem. So he promises Mary, after this, you will have a different life. And hours later, that was true.
Yeah, and she's already lived this life of like unimaginable tragedy and is about to be sitting right next to her husband when he gets shot.
It's anachronistic to say that she had PTSD. It's not hard to imagine. And before that, her moods were admittedly unpredictable. But the loss of her husband to such profound violence right in front of her, and her 3 children to illness, and other intimates to various scandals and disappointing situations, left her feeling alienated and paranoid.
I think that's fair.
Right. Right. So there's a famous print from the night that Lincoln was assassinated. And I think this sums it up pretty well. His entire cabinet is next to his bedside, but there is someone missing, Mary, because the cabinet, men he had appointed, had banished Mary. She's wearing her blood-soaked dress, and she is not allowed to be in the same room with her husband's body.
How can they do that?
They're men. She's a woman. It's the 19th century. Like any first lady, she's no stranger to being assailed by men in government, by the public. It doesn't help that we're talking about a time when yellow journalism and the stories about like her existence as a truly nomadic widow seem to the public like she has a scandal a year. And it sells very well. So these sensational headlines did leave the impression before the 10-year anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. It left the impression of a volatile existence. The problem was that when it came to the insanity trial, her usual response to this kind of scrutiny wasn't applicable. It didn't work. So when Lincoln's friends or foes treated her poorly, she would just physically disappear for a long bout. She would hole up in a hotel room, or she would flee the country and write a never-ending number of letters in her own defense. That's what she had been doing. That's why people think her name is Mary Todd Lincoln. When William Herndon, another one of Lincoln's awful law partners, described her, quote, unlovableness as the kind that felt like a toothache, kept one awake day and night. And remember, Herndon, as I talked about before, is a spurned suitor of Mary's. But in general, he was not the only person who found her to be outspoken and dramatic and a bit too much.
Yeah, we talked. Herndon came up in the rabbit holes episode, and where I admittedly goaded you into correcting me because this is where Mary Todd Lincoln comes from rather than
Yes,
Mary Lincoln.
yes, yes. So in 1875, she's been the widow of Lincoln for a decade, and it has been lonely. She's been experiencing these migraines, and her most recent one, which struck while she was wintering in Florida before the trial, felt different to her. It was accompanied by this nightmare, and it was terrible. She couldn't ignore it. She had dreamt that Robert, her only surviving son, had fallen ill, and it was terminal. And so she needed to talk about this with someone, but she doesn't necessarily believe it's true. She doesn't really have anyone to talk to, but she's worried about him. And she thinks that maybe this is like a manifestation of being worried about her son, the mother's intuition. She's paranoid, yes, but she has a lot to be paranoid about. So she telegrams him. She hops on the next train bound for Chicago. She goes straight from the station to Robert's law office, which ends up helping him quite a bit.
She goes there before she goes to the hotel.
Yes. She hasn't heard back from him yet. So she goes to his law office with all that percolating. She's not in the best state. She may have made a scene. She saw Robert was well. She was relieved. And also, Mary Lincoln walks into your law office. It's not a surprise. You know that she is Robert Lincoln's mother, but you're not expecting her. So obviously, everyone's going to pay attention to her. And if she looks like she's been traveling all day from Florida to Chicago, and she also has had a migraine, she's going to look the part. And by the way, this is exactly how a colleague of mine described another colleague who had just come to work after having a migraine, but could not miss a meeting. I think they're making a big deal out of it because these witnesses also noted that Mary asked Robert to accompany her to the hotel and check the smoke alarms in every room as if that was really odd. But Chicago had just been up in flames.
Right. So they're saying, like, look at this weird lady. She wants him to do this crazy thing, but it's Chicago at this moment in history, which burns down like every 5 years.
Okay. So Robert is, he's mortified, which I do get. He wasn't expecting her. But this is an overreaction because it's not about her and it's not totally about the anniversary of his father's death because he has his own agenda, just like she has her own agenda. He wants to run for office. And people need to remember that he is the son of Abraham Lincoln. If Mary is there, she's going to dominate the headlines. So his advisors tell him what he already wanted to hear: silence her. And the easiest way to do that in the 19th century is you just declare a woman insane.
So this is all Robert.
Yes, it's Robert, his advisors, and people who just didn't like her and hadn't liked her for a long time and felt like they had this ownership over Lincoln's legacy and his memory.
Yeah. Okay. So this is about controlling the legacy and memory of Abraham Lincoln for Robert Lincoln's future political prospects. And Mary Lincoln is just like in the way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
does she know that her only surviving child is behind this plot to have her declared insane and silenced?
No, because he has been playing the role of dutiful son. He stopped by to visit her that very morning. He said, I will see you this afternoon. To his credit, technically true, because he was waiting at the courthouse. She doesn't suspect him. She doesn't have enough time to. Sweat told her this was Robert's idea. But clearly, Robert had feared his resolve because she's not crazy. So he sent Sweat, who had, as predicted, grown impatient with Mary. She did not want to go to the courthouse for obvious reasons, so he began to threaten her. She could walk with him to the courthouse, or he could have a policeman put her in manacles. And if she chose that route, she should probably know that the press was waiting at the courthouse.
Jesus. Jesus fucking Christ.
Yes. So she has no choice. Mary Lincoln has to go with Sweat to a kangaroo court where, in the process of 3 hours, everything will be taken away from her. 18 witnesses, including Robert, testified to her mental state.
Many of which we've already established had never, I think, maybe even met her before.
Mm-hmm.
So what's her lawyer doing? She's got a lawyer, right?
Yes. Isaac Arnold, Mary's appointed lawyer by the prosecution. He didn't call a single witness in her defense. He asked a few of the doctors to confirm their credentials. And when he was satisfied that they were indeed experts, he had no other questions for them. And Mary, meanwhile, this person who is crazy, is frustrating everyone in the room, particularly journalists, because they're there to see some sort of indication of her madness. They wanted her in manacles. They wanted her looking disheveled as she'd been described in the law office. But instead, she is sitting there quietly, absolutely shocked into silence.
Yeah, she's getting absolutely railroaded here. How is this even legal?
No one seemed concerned that at the trial of the widow of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, every procedure had been violated. She should have received legal notice of an impending hearing in advance. She should have had enough time to hire her own attorney, to consult with her own attorney, to call witnesses, any sort of preparation. But there was none. So it didn't take a long time for the all-male jury for them to come to a conclusion. It took 10 minutes for them to declare her insane. Guess who the court designated as her conservator? Robert. They revoked her financial autonomy, and the court ordered her committed to an asylum run by Dr. Robert Patterson. Now, Dr. Patterson had been there for all 3 hours. He had testified against Mary in court. But that was the first time they actually met, when he took her into custody.
That's all insane. She's not insane. This is insane. And I think if I'm doing the math here right, we're like 4 hours and 10 minutes since she was told that this was all happening, right? Because she got told an hour before the trial starts, then the trial takes 3 hours, and then they deliberate for like 10 minutes. We're like 4 hours and 10 minutes later, and she's been stripped of everything by a bunch of dudes who have never literally met her.
Right. And notice I haven't mentioned anyone's with her. She's alone. She is utterly alone.
Well, she wasn't alone. She had her son, Robert, who would always be there for her, right? her last
Right.
surviving close relative. He was there to take care of her, check the smoke detectors, make sure nothing bad happened to her. And then he's like one of the ringleaders of all this.
Yes. And Robert has Dr. Patterson and all the other fine men who are helping him with his problem woman. Dr. Patterson was well known for treating lady patients at Bellevue, which was not anything we would recognize as a hospital. It's basically a multi-story house set on a couple dozen acres of countryside outside of Chicago. And it's a funny place. I mean, it had bars on the patient's windows, but you weren't allowed to call them bars. Dr. Patterson insisted they be called ornamental screens.
Great.
I think we should hear from Dr. Patterson. So I am going to give you, Mike Duncan, his notes from May 1875. So when she was admitted. And can you read from the top of page 26, please?
Oh, I'm now playing the role of Dr. Patterson, direct primary source.
Mm-hmm.
May 1875. 20th. Mrs. Mary Lincoln admitted today from Chicago, age 56, widow of ex-President Lincoln, declared insane by the Cook County Court May 19th, 1875. Case is one of mental impairment, which probably dates back to the murder of President Lincoln, more pronounced since the death of her son, but especially aggravated during the last 2 months. May 21st. Mrs. Lincoln slept well last night. Today her pulse is 100, but she has no fever. May 22nd. Mrs. Lincoln has seemed cheerful and is apparently contented. She took a long walk this morning, sleeps well at night.
Mary Lincoln was Dr. Patterson's most high-profile patient at Bellevue. He had better paying patients, but Mary Lincoln, by far the most famous patient. But I use the word patient pretty loosely. He did not treat her like a patient. She took her meals with Patterson's family, his wife, his children in full dinner dress, or she ate alone in her private suite. She was free to wander the grounds. She had full use of the Patterson family carriage.
So she's getting special treatment here.
Yeah, she's not getting treatment for insanity. She's getting treatment for being stuck in this place people know she shouldn't be. Most of the women under his care were an inconvenience to fathers who could not marry them off or husbands who had no patience for postpartum depression or personal opinions.
Yeah, it does not sound like she is somebody who is like a danger to herself or society, or they believe is a danger to herself or society or anything like that. This is just a woman who's at this place with them and they have to take care of her. So what's his end game? What's Patterson's end game? Does he hope to just keep Mary around forever?
He starts bringing in reporters to view the grounds where Mary Lincoln spends her days and write these glowing articles about his care of the first widow. But the funny thing is, of course, he can arrange the interviews, but it does not mean that she has to talk to them.
Okay, so that sounds awful. She's basically being treated as his prop right now.
Yes, it is awful. And it's so awful that it actually starts to work in her favor. One of the reporters was from the Chicago Post and Mail. And even though she, of course, refused to meet with him, it didn't stop him from printing a totally false story about her. They wrote that her hair had gone white and her dress was shabby. It was really something to behold. The thing is, the dates don't allow for that kind of change. That story was published within a week of the Kangaroo Court, but it surprised readers. They were accustomed to stories about her extravagant taste in fine clothing. So they began for the first time to pity her, how far she had fallen.
But she's not going to take this lying down, right? Like people are beginning to pity her. But does she have any sort of plan for herself on how to get out of this situation that she's found herself in?
Yeah, she has some ideas. She isn't waiting for a savior, but she's trying to cast someone in that role. And one of the people she's trying to cast in that role is Myra Bradwell, who was the first woman admitted to the Illinois bar, but the US Supreme Court blocked her license. They argued that a woman's sphere did not extend to the law. Still, she managed to do some things without it.
The Supreme Court literally stepped in and blocked her from getting the law license that she had gotten.
Well, it's a very masculine endeavor.
Wow. Okay. So how is she going to help Mary without having a law degree? Can she get into anything?
Well, here's the thing. She has a column, and a column can be more influential than any law degree under the right circumstances. The column was called Women's Rights, which would tank now, but was apparently quite popular back then. And she wrote a lot about how men could have women in their family committed without due process. There was one case in particular about a Calvinist minister who successfully incarcerated his wife in an asylum based solely on one medical examination, during which the doctor had done no more than taken her pulse.
Wow. I mean, Mary Lincoln just got committed by a bunch of dudes who had never even met her.
Many of them had not. So Myra wrote a ton about that case and got the laws changed. So it's really promising for Mary. This is a high profile case. It has great potential for Myra, so she's invested. It looks good.
And what's her process?
Myra is writing, obviously, she's doing research about the case, but she's going to people in Lincoln's inner circle. We have only heard from the people in that inner circle who didn't like Mary, but there were plenty who did and who also felt terrible about what was happening because remember, this has been all over the news. So she works Mary's most influential contacts. And within months, politicians and these like revered Civil War generals are voicing public support. They're giving quotes. And in some instances, they're even writing their own commentary and their own opinion pieces. And other newspapers are noticing. So, like the Chicago Times, whose motto was print the news and raise hell, took the issue on as its own.
Okay, so this has become a real cause celeb here, and there's justice is a coming down the mountain.
Yes, but that's what's happening out in the open. Mary is also working the back channels. She has enlisted her sister, Elizabeth Edwards of Springfield, Illinois, to write letters about what she knows because something happened before the trial. Robert Lincoln went to visit his Aunt Elizabeth in Springfield.
But wait, she wasn't at the trial, right? Because you said Mary had like nobody who was there in her corner.
No, she was not at the trial. Robert had visited his aunt for support before the trial, but she had refused. And she, for whatever reason, did not make it to Chicago. But that whole story was left out of the narrative for a very important reason. Aunt Elizabeth had offered an alternative. She wanted to care for Mary, for her sister in her own home, but Robert had refused her offer because he felt threatened. She would still be high profile. His mother would still have financial independence.
Oh, Robert, you large adult son, you.
And then he goes and he makes it worse. He's obviously offering commentary himself, but he's not quoting experts or relying on testimony because, it was garbage or explaining the law or anything that would be useful to his cause. Instead, he's attacking Myra Bradwell, who's well liked, who's respected for being, and he calls her this, a high priestess of a gang of spiritualists.
How is this all going to work out for him?
It's not working. It's backfiring. He has to walk it back. So he needs to make some sort of grand gesture to the public and, by extension, his mother, that would convince everyone that he's not a monster. So he agrees. He will send Mary to live with Elizabeth, hoping that the papers will just accept this as an act of love. But they did not. Everything was now obvious. There was no decent reason that Mary Lincoln should have been put through that ordeal. In her diary, she wrote, "I was so cruelly persecuted by a bad son, on whom I had bestowed the greater part of my all."
Man, I mean,
Yeah.
if you're doing stuff that like starts to drive out like a mother's love for you, you've really stepped in it.
But you can see how palpably hurt she is. Also sort of saying, I would have given you anything you wanted if you had just asked for it. And she likes Springfield, but she's not comfortable. She just can't relax because she's almost like a caged bird. I mean, she is a caged bird. She has to be there. And so she's also taken to carrying a pistol, which did not, given the circumstances, strike the Edwards household as unreasonable or paranoid, which was a real change. Elizabeth's husband, Mr. Edwards, was a big fan of Mary's, and that was a nice change too. He once said that she could, quote, make a bishop forget his prayers.
Ooh.
I know. And what's also nice is he was a lawyer and he agreed to represent Mary at her next hearing. He performed beautifully in court, and in short order, the jury voted in her favor.
Yeah, it's almost like if you're given adequate counsel and not just like thrown in front of a kangaroo court that has decided to conspire to already have a verdict in mind that you know there's going to be a different outcome. So how did this all go for Robert? Like how did this all work out for him?
Not great. Not great. He did not run for office. And Mary wrote to him about a month later. She was back in Springfield. She wrote, "You have tried your game of robbery long enough." He didn't reply. And they didn't really communicate directly. It was through lawyers or extended family. And the estrangement was a tremendous loss on top of the public humiliation. She didn't have anyone, but it also left her room and these new opportunities to find intimacy and happiness in unexpected places. She grew very close to her nieces and nephews, and the press had never been kinder to her, which was really nice. And then her finances improved. The late Charles Sumner, famous for, among other things, being caned in Congress, had initially met resistance when he, who was a friend of the Lincolns and a friend of Mary's, had lobbied Congress to establish a pension in 1869. And back then, lawmakers had cited a lack of precedent, which was true. Mary was the first widow by assassination. But after they saw this ordeal with Robert play out in the papers and saw that she was truly alone, they voted on their own accord to retroactively increase it.
Okay, so now all is well, right? We are entering the happy ending phase of Mary Lincoln's life. She spent years being kind of vilified, and then it hit an acute crisis where she's like front page scandal news. She's this crazy woman that needed to be locked up, and then the fever broke, and now it's sunshine for her and happiness, right? Tell me it's sunshine and happiness for Mary Lincoln.
It's not quite sunshine and happiness. America had finally come around to the first widow, and Mary thought about using that shift in public opinion to further Abraham Lincoln's legacy, because he really needs the help. But that meant that she would be high profile. And being high profile, she had found put her at risk. She was still worried about Robert. And more than that, she was worried about herself as long as Robert was around. He had a new baby and another on the way, and she was desperate to be a grandmother to them. She feared that Robert would use that against her. She knew that if he reached out, she would reconcile and then probably lose everything. So it was just too risky. She had to cut herself off at the source.
But she can't avoid him forever. Can she avoid him forever?
She can if she moves abroad. So in 1876, she declares rather dramatically, "I go in exile alone." And she settles in this small commune in southwest France. And it was known for like temperate climate and natural warm springs. It was the kind of thing that people, went to the continent for. It took about 20 minutes to get across the small town by foot, but it wasn't provincial. It was a place that wealthy Europeans frequented, and there were fashionable casinos and invitation-only social clubs. So Mary, who spoke French, remained abroad for 6 years, 6 pretty happy years. And then her arthritis started acting up and her eyesight weakened. She couldn't really walk those wide boulevards and admire the colorful dresses. So she didn't have much time left. Living abroad didn't make sense. Her fear of Robert didn't make sense. But what seemed very clear to her is that she didn't have a lot of time left. So even if he harbored these acrimonious plans against her, he wouldn't be able to enact them before she died. So she goes to Springfield, and he comes right away to see her. And not only does he come to see her right away, but he brings one of her granddaughters. And she's excited to see him again and is really grateful for the time that they have together.
So they did get to spend some time together at the end.
She dies a few months later. She was buried next to Lincoln, wearing the ring he had proposed to her with. that he'd had engraved, "Love is eternal." And that was true for husband and wife. And as it turns out, for mother and son. Because though, as you said, it seemed like he might even be turning a mother's love, he hadn't. Years before they reconciled, Mary had asked Myra Bradwell to prepare a will, and she left Robert the entirety of her estate. It was worth roughly 1.6 million today.
Wow. And that's when they're still not speaking to each other.
That's when he had her locked up.
Yeah. It sure feels like Robert could have gotten whatever it is that he wanted out of all of this, um, simply by going about it like a different way.
Yes, he could have gone about it a very different way. It's incredibly sad. It's sad to read. As a historian, obviously everything is in hindsight. It's quite easy to participate in coulda, woulda, shouldas. But my goodness, it's a real lesson for us. Don't put away your mother.
No,
You
don't put
don't
away your
need
mother.
to. She's going to give you the
Right.
money anyway.
Yeah. Or you just ask her to go live with her sister in Springfield. Like, it's
You're
fine. Just
embarrassing me.
have some conversations with your mother about these things. And then, of course, you know, like it's not like Mary Lincoln looms large at this moment in like the American historical imagination, besides just being Lincoln's widow. And what that means is, like, one of the few things that I think people do kind of know about her, if they know anything, is like, oh, Mary Lincoln, kind of crazy, right? That's, I think, the first thing that leaps to anyone's mind. If you know even a few things about her, it's like one of the two or three first things you know.
It's a really sad story, but I hope that we try to remember her for the eccentric, mercurial delight that she was and for the partnership she provided Lincoln. This is like one of these fights I feel like I'll be fighting forever. But I think it speaks to a larger problem, obviously, in society, that we call women crazy a little too easily.
Right. Like, anytime there's a bit of personality that starts to come out of anyone who's not supposed to have a personality, like a first wife, like a first lady, yeah, then it's just, well, she's crazy.
Okay, so what did we learn? We learned it's Mary Lincoln, not Mary Todd Lincoln. She wasn't crazy, she was colorful. Just ask your parents for money. Don't put them away, or at least
Mm-hmm.
start with a conversation. Don't call women crazy. Anything else?
Yeah, if you want to run for office, just have a conversation with her.
Just run for office, man. Just do it on your
Yeah,
own.
yeah. You do not have to drag your own mother through the mud.
These are lessons we can all take to heart. You take us out.
That was the Duncan and Co. History Show. I was Mike Duncan. She was Alexis Co. She still is Alexis Co. And I still am Mike Duncan. And that was our show.